Welcome to the Best Books Podcast, an Orchard Hill Church podcast that helps you choose your next book. I'm your host, Jonathan Thede. Today, I have the privilege to welcome someone to Best Books who I've wanted to get on for a long time, someone who's still fairly new to Orchard Hill, I would say. Please welcome to the show for episode 22, Next Gen Coordinator, Will Stevens. Will, how's it going?
Yo, it's great to be here.
Yeah.
Glad to be here. It's been a while coming, hasn't it?
Yeah, definitely. So walk me through, what is a Next Gen Coordinator?
I know,
I feel like that's a new churchy way of saying, like, you're a youth pastor, young adult director, all in one.
No, I joke about the fact that I feel like every time I meet somebody, I'm a little hesitant. I'm like, what will they think I'm saying when I say what my title is? But basically it means most of my time goes to working with student ministry, so middle and high school, and then I split the rest of my time between helping Kidsburg at Butler and then also helping with young adults. So kind of anywhere post-baby and post-having babies, I guess is what you could say.
There you go. That's too long of a title, so we just
It is, that's right.
Coordinator. Yep. And we should say, you alluded to already, but you're up at the Butler campus with Brady. And
that's right.
Yeah. Tell me about how that opportunity sort of came about.
Yeah, for sure. So I was in college down in Grove City, and I was there for biblical studies. So essentially, I knew I wanted to step into student ministry, and my prayer and hope was always, Lord, if you will, please let me step into a role at the church I'm already attending. Because that's more natural, right? You're already plugged in, you already know people. And lo and behold, Emily and I, my now wife, were searching for a church a couple years ago, and we got plugged into the Butler campus because Brady went to the same college I did. I knew Pastor Kurt's son, and that was enough reason to try it out. And we started going there, and then we figured out really quickly that they didn't have a whole lot in program actively happening at the time for student ministry. And in other words, I saw an opportunity, and the Lord really opened up a lot of doors for that to naturally kind of play into a role. So yeah,
that's awesome. But back us up a little bit more. So with your story, I'm kind of assuming you'd already known you wanted to be in ministry in some capacity. Like had you sort of felt that way going into college, or is that something that became more and more clear as you studied?
Yeah, it happened essentially, I would say, junior year of high school. So I didn't really know what I wanted to do. I was fairly aimless through most of high school, thinking generally, do I want to go into history? Do I want to go into journalism? And then actually in high school, I got to be a leader for my school when we had a middle school winter retreat. And I got to help plan that. I got to teach at it and just be a cabin leader. And right at that moment, I realized I would love to do this full time, whether it be youth pastorship, something with like a parachurch ministry, like Young Life, whatever. I saw it something I felt like I was called to. So that was starting in high school, and that's why I went to college for biblical studies, to pursue that training to kind of prepare me for it. So
totally. Yeah. And backing up even more, you're not from Pittsburgh originally, so maybe just give us a flavor of what it was like growing up, what it was like sort of. Was faith a part of your experience in your family, or is that something you discovered sort of in your high school years?
Right. Yeah, so I was born in Texas, only lived there for a couple years, and then I moved to Idaho, not by myself, with the rest of my family. And we lived in Idaho from when I was 3 till about 18. My family's still there. And not Iowa, it's Idaho. So
you get that confusion a lot?
I do. Actually, a lot of people.
I was born in Iowa, actually.
Were you really?
So,
yeah. They get, for some reason.
We're kindred spirits.
That's right. People always think I'm from like Central America, and I'm like, that's not quite where Idaho is. But
yeah, I know what you mean.
Center of America, yes.
Yeah, center,
So anyway, I grew up there. My whole family, they're believers. Both my parents came to faith actually after high school or in college. So they weren't raised in Christian households, but they both came to faith and kind of raised us up in the way. So I knew from a pretty early age that I wanted to follow Christ, and it really came into more of a mature standing in high school, like we were talking about earlier. So
help me understand the spiritual climate generally in Idaho. I know you have to paint with a broad brush, and it's every town I'm sure is different. But is it kind of like the Bible Belt? Is it like California? Like, so what's the spiritual climate like?
For sure. I would say Idaho is can kind of fall prey to what a lot of America can, where if you're American, you're Christian.
Yeah.
Kind of that idea in Idaho, where,
Sure.
it's what we do in society. It's what the cultural norms are. We go to church on Sundays. I went to a private Christian school, so that even more so, right? It's just the habit, it's the rituals. And it was a great place to grow up, but at the same time, just like anywhere, you have to come to those decisions. Is this just my ritual, or is this actually a relationship and something independently in my heart that's coming to fruit? So I would say not for everybody, obviously, but where I grew up and the context I was in, it was definitely very Christian, at least in culture. But sometimes I think that could be more habit than actual relationship, for sure.
Yeah, and I'm sure that background helps you in your current role with students as well, just not taking it for granted, just the fact that just because you go to church, it doesn't exactly mean that you believe and you're walking the walk. So,
For sure.
what's something most people don't know about you,
Something most people don't know.
other than that you're from Iowa? Would you say?
Idaho.
Is that what you said?
Right,
Oh, okay.
right.
Yeah. Sorry.
Something most people don't know, I really enjoy cooking.
Okay.
I love cooking, and I think I got that from my mom.
Yeah.
So
nice.
she's an amazing cook, always cooked really good meals. I think made me a little bit snobby with food for sure growing up, because I just had these awesome like restaurant level meals growing up. So I love to cook. I got a Blackstone back home. Love doing stir fry, fajitas, anything like that. So
I know what a Blackstone is, but maybe some people out there
Sure.
don't.
Right.
I don't know what a Blackstone is.
It is a flat top grill.
Okay.
So basically like what you'd see in a restaurant,
Yeah.
it's that type of thing. So you can cook real big breakfast on it, whatever. So that's what I would say.
Can't wait till I get the invite.
Hey,
yeah,
sometime soon.
anytime. We'll be recording this podcast remotely in the future.
That's right.
At Will's
At
place.
the Blackstone.
Yeah. So today, Will and I will be discussing the book "You're Only Human" by Kapic. This book is it for anyone who feels sort of tired or hurried by life. So, Will, just as we sort of dive into the overall topic, I didn't prepare you for this question, so if you don't have a good
Perfect.
answer, let me know. What is a time recently where you felt extremely tired, or maybe just that you think about your whole life? Like, is there maybe you did like a lock-in event as a kid, or what's a time that you just felt extremely tired?
You don't actually have to go back very far. This weekend we had a camp for middle schoolers, and it was an amazing opportunity, but it meant I went into the weekend having worked a week, and into the weekend working actually more than I do in a normal week, and then into the normal cadence again of a new week. So that was a time where things just kind of rolled one into another. Your body might want to take a break, but your life doesn't want to take a break. So I would say even this week is kind of a microcosm of a time where the requirements are heavy, and the effects can make you definitely really fatigued. So even this week, I would say.
Yeah, totally. Well, this book was an extreme encouragement to me. I'm so glad that you chose it. So maybe just give the listeners a flavor. Why did you choose this book? What interested you about this topic?
Yeah, so I read this book, You're Only Human, back in college a couple years ago, and it really had a profound effect on me during that season of my life, because being in school, you kind of grade your identity and really how you're doing in your life season based off your GPA, your social status, with how many buddies you got, all sorts of things like that. Everything feels like it's kind of leaning forward in the saddle, right? Where you're waiting, I need to finish this class so I can get to the next semester. I need to finish this semester so I can graduate, ... So this book really kind of attacking that idea of being really basing your identity and your accomplishments really was kind of a splash of cold water in my face in a time where I really needed it. So especially when I read it, that context kind of was really important for me.
Yeah. So one of the if you were to give this book a topic, I think it's about sort of our limits and human finitude. So how would you describe, you just did a good job of describing sort of why you chose it, but how would you describe, if you give someone like a very quick hit, like, hey, what are you reading? I'm reading You're Only Human. Oh, what's it about? What would you say?
Yeah, so human finitude is that phrase he uses a lot, which might seem a little bit foreign. How often do I use the word finitude?
Sure.
Not very often, but it is really that idea of talking about how there is sinfulness, right, in humans and in this world, but there's also just limits that God has designed us with. So how do we differentiate those things? How do we see what are parts of me that are broken that I need to give to God to redeem, but also what are parts of me that actually God designed that way for a purpose? And specifically, I think with human finitude, he talks a lot about the idea of being dependent, and how we are created to be dependent creatures, because that reminds us we're not God, and it reminds us that we need a God who is independent of us and actually capable of not having limits. So that's probably what I would say, yeah.
Yeah. I think that's super helpful, and just like it was for you, I mean, I think this book would be helpful for anyone who just feels tired, who feels just the weight of really expectation that we put on ourselves, that our culture puts on puts on us. I think that was an eye opener for me, just how much of the expectations are self-imposed. You know, I think sometimes we conflate sort of the expectations that we feel with, okay, this is what God expects of me.
Yeah.
But then and sometimes that's true, but I think most of the time we peel that back and we say, well, that was sort of imposed on me by my family, by my culture, by my friends. You know, they're often external expectations, and I think there's a lot of freedom in being able to sort of, you know, somewhat throw those aside.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, so let me just run through some topics that I think this book touches on. So the first one we already talked about is human finitude, just a fancy way of saying limitations. We all have limits. Exhaustion or burnout, you know, I think that's the feeling that we have when we're sort of facing our limits. Success, that was probably the one that spoke most to me. We can talk about that in a second. Expectations, we just ran through that. Where's your identity? You know, how do I know that God loves me when I do feel burnt out? Just being human, I think that was a big topic, and just the how God sees that in a good way. You know, I think sometimes we talk about I'm only human. You know, I think even the title of the book kind of assumes negativity, but I think it's really eye-opening to see that's a positive thing. And then finally, just like humility, I think that's something we can talk about as well. So of those topics, or any that I didn't even list, did any of them specifically resonate with you or stick out to you as you read?
Yeah, I would say probably the first would be the idea of us, and I think this kind of has to go with humility, being dependent. And the reason I say that is because a main point of the book is with human limits, like as an example, our need to rest, right? Our need to sleep. I've heard many people say, oh, if only I didn't need to sleep, you know, then I could have 8 more hours in the day to finish what I need to do my hobbies, whatever. And we kind of view our need to sleep as a boundary for us, as in we could be more productive if we didn't need that. Whereas really, and this actually isn't, I don't think from this book, but a really powerful thing I was told once is sleep is is a very active way to worship God, because it's a very real way that you're putting your complete trust in Him. In this moment when I'm completely vulnerable, I'm going to rest in you. I think that's actually talked about in the Psalms, right, where it's rest that comes from the Lord. And that, as an example, seeing our humanity is not always about our weakness, but it's about our dependence. And that makes us look to the one that doesn't rely on sleep, doesn't rely on sustenance to be who He is. So I think really God created us that way in order to naturally draw our hearts more to Him. So that kind of idea of humility and being, I am not the end-all be-all. I do have limits. I can't do everything I'd like to do, or even everything I have to do. I do have boundaries, but that's for a reason. That's because I need to remember I am not the God of my life. So that really stuck out to me. And then second, you brought up identity. That theme in the book is really prominent to me. The idea, where are you putting your identity? Are you putting your identity in your achievements, what you're doing, your job, your family, your relationships, whatever, fill in the blank? Or are you putting your identity in the fact that we are all called to be children of God? Because that is a fact that's not dependent on our output or our success. That's just dependent on who we are. And I think that goes back to the idea of God loves us because He created us. He created us for a good purpose, not because we're going to be efficient tools, but because He wanted us to be His children. So those two for me, dependence and identity.
Absolutely. Sure. Yeah, and you mentioned sort of, passion in the Bible to talk about sleep, and I just wanted to put a finer point on that. In Psalm 127, he says, "Unless the Lord builds the house, the builders labor in vain. Unless the Lord watches over the city, the guards stand watch in vain." And then kind of speaking to what you said, "In vain you rise early and stay up late, toiling for food to eat, for he grants sleep to those he loves." So
Exactly, yeah.
I love we can say it all we want, but I think what I love about the Old Testament is it often works in pictures. And so you get this picture of this person who's staying up late trying to make it happen.
Yeah.
Because like you said, it's this belief that it all depends on me.
Right.
If I don't do it, who will? No one's going to look after me. And just a couple of chapters later, there's Psalm 131, which I love because it's very short. It's like 2 verses. And David says, "My heart is not proud, Lord. My eyes are not haughty. I don't concern myself with great matters or things too wonderful for me. But I've calmed and quieted myself. I am like a weaned child with its mother. Like a weaned child, I am content." And I think what I love about this book is I think the author does such a great job of weaving the problem and the solution together, because I think he shows how humility in a very topsy-turvy sort of way is the answer. Because so often the reason we have these expectations is because we want to be someone. We want to be successful. We want to be able to prove to people that we grew up with that like I am someone. And Psalm 131 that I just read reminds us, true happiness comes from when we look to God and we say, "God, you're all that matters. As long as I have your approval, that's all I need."
Right.
And something that has popped up in my life a lot lately, I don't know if you can resonate with this. Like you, I didn't grow up here. My parents are only 10 hours away, which to you probably seems like nothing. But once you get married and buy a house, there are things in your life that for the first time you realize like I'm no longer like a parented person. I still have my parents. My parents are a great resource for me. Me and my parents still talk weekly, very often. But there's just that sense that you have as a kid that, hey, if I don't do it, then my parents will.
Right.
Like if I really needed help, I have someone to call to. And I think that's why I love this picture in Psalm 131 where he says, I'm like a weaned child with its mother. And it's just a reminder of us, no matter how old we get, no matter how, I guess, big we get or responsible we get, there's a cry in our hearts that really wants to be parented.
Absolutely.
We want to believe that we can run to God when things are sort of not going the way that we want. And so I just think that's like a beautiful metaphor that sometimes I think we read in Scripture, then we kind of just gloss our eyes over, like, yeah, God's like a parent, whatever. The idea of God as Father is so prevalent in our culture and in our Christian culture. But really sitting down and thinking about that, I think, is valuable. What would my life look like if I treated God like I treat my parents? If I ran to them in the same way.
Exactly. Yeah.
So, getting a little bit more personal, what's your experience with limitations? Is that something in your life that you said this was sort of like a splash of cold water to you? Has it always been that way, or are you one to sort of like push your limitations, always accepting more responsibility?
I would say absolutely yes.
Okay.
I've definitely, and this is not a good attribute, I've definitely always been a perfectionist, I think, whether it be my schooling, whether it be with relationships, whatever it is. I never want to disappoint. And I think that does lead me to thinking any sort of breakdown in my responsibilities is the end of the world. So I really do think that is why it was that cold splash of water in the face, because it has been a bad habit of mine to think my worth or my acceptance with the people I love or whatever all depends on me and what I'm doing, and if I'm doing it well enough, and if I'm putting forward the best impression, right? So all those things. I think that was a habit that was instilled in me since I was a kid, really. Being the youngest in the family, really never wanting to let my parents down or anything like that. I think that filtered into adult life for sure with schooling, but then also in the workplace. Where, of course, I do think we're also called to excellence, right? This isn't an excuse to say let's let go of all of our responsibilities, not at all. But at the same time, realizing I'm not always going to be perfect. I'm not always going to do this perfectly well. And it's because I'm not God. I am not. And that kind of automatically instills in you this level of humility that needs to be there. So, it was definitely a good reminder for me in those ways.
Definitely. How much of this do you think, as you were talking, I just wondered, You and I are probably wired very similarly. I think from the outside, someone would call us type A or perfectionistic sort of thing. So how much of this do you think boils down to just your personality versus how much do you think, I guess my question is, do you think this is a universal problem? Do you think people who are, I have friends in my life who aren't the most driven, aren't the most
Yeah.
but do you think there's a sense in which we all struggle with this, or is this kind of just for, I guess, people like us?
I definitely think it is for everybody.
Yeah.
I think it can be a little bit more obviously for those that are maybe trying to overachieve. But I think it really applies to anybody, because I think the bottom line and the root problem that this book is really talking about is us trying to put ourself in God's place, where we're trying to say, because of me, I'm going to rule my life. Because of me, I'm going to do what I need to do, or I'm going to live in the way that I want to live. I don't think that just applies to if we overwork. I think it applies on the other end of the spectrum, like we kind of hit on a minute ago, where you can take this too far. And you can use the fact that we're creatures as an excuse to fall into the sinful parts of who we are. Because that's something I think Kelly Kapic really differentiates really importantly, is that he is not saying because we're limited, we then get exempt from all sin or brokenness in our life. He's making that distinction really clear. Like, no, our limits should call us to lean on God in order for him to, right, it says in 2 Corinthians, I think, that in like your weakness, my power is made perfect. Just something along those lines. So I think this book actually applies equally to both sides of the equation, just in different ways. Are we leaning into this too much, or are we completely ignoring it? So,
Definitely.
yeah.
So what do you think is, I guess, the proper application for when you do a really intense weekend with student ministry and you're extremely tired? Like what is, because I think what you're touching on is really important, because the last thing we want is to present this book in such a way. I'm nervous even by the title. You're only human. It does sound like an excuse. Like that's what we say when it's kind of an excuse that we make in our culture. So what do we do when we feel sort of those mini burnouts? Like is there, because oftentimes in our lives we feel that, but like there's still sort of work to be done.
Yeah.
So I guess my question is, what does it look like to really give that over to God?
I think a huge thing is looking at the example of Christ, as always, because he, being fully man and fully God, right, is the perfect example of ministry. And ministry does not just apply to those that are in it as a career path. And I think it applies to any person that's pursuing Christ. We're called to be ministers for him, pushing people towards God. And I think, what do you see when Jesus has been around the crowds and he's been teaching the masses for a really long time? What does he have to do? Several times in the scriptures, in the Gospels, he has to leave and go for a bit of isolation, which doesn't always work out, right? But it's the idea of leaving, but to do what? Resting to recharge. I think that's an important piece. Like, we need to rest. We need those times where we do recharge, whether that be, whatever it is for you, taking a nap or reading a book or playing a game, something like that, spending time with your loved ones. But we need to do that for the express intention of getting back in the ring in order to both mirror God's love to people and love, because one thing Kelly talks about is within our limits, as a possibility, is to love our neighbor and God with our whole heart. So it doesn't excuse us from those things, but I think it does explain the fact that we do need time to plug back in, to recharge, so we can go out and do it effectively.
Yeah. Speaking of Jesus, what came to mind is when he's being tempted by the devil, and the devil's basically like, hey, if you do this for me, I'll make you great. I'll make you a success sort of in this world. And Jesus is able to resist. And I think that's, like I said, this book just weaves so many important things together. And I think that thread of identity you were talking about just holds it all. Because Jesus had his identity sound, and he said, I'm a child of God, and there's really nothing you can do to take that away from me. Whereas so often when we ask the most important question, which is what in my life are wants and what are needs, because there are times in our lives where I leave work and I haven't gotten half the things on my to-do list done, and yet you have a choice there, right? Am I going to stay late and stay till 8 o'clock and cancel plans maybe with the people in my life, people that, like you said, God has called me to minister to? Or am I going to say, okay, because it didn't get done, I'm going to trust that God will give me time in the rest of my week? And so I think that's sometimes going along with what we said about sleep earlier, sometimes that is the greatest act of worship, just
Yeah.
to say, God, I trust you. I trust that this will get done. Now, that's not to say, we have deadlines. We have things that are really important. I'm not trying to imply that it's somehow sinful to grind for a season or to stay up late. And I don't think the psalmist is saying that either. But I think we know our hearts probably, in that situation. Am I becoming am I believing that it all depends on me,
Right.
or am I trusting in God in this moment?
Well, can I share something to that real fast?
Yeah,
So,
absolutely.
in senior year, I was doing my senior seminar class, which was by far the most grueling class I did. Included like this mini dissertation type paper and a really difficult textbook we were using. And my professor said this really helpful analogy that I thought was really good, where he said, a lot of times we view in our life our work-life balance or our rest and work as like a weight and a balance, where we have to keep things balanced. And if we don't, then it's gonna get bad. He said, that's not a realistic way to live, right? Different seasons are gonna be easier, different seasons are gonna be a lot harder. What he said and kind of proposed as a different illustration was, we need to view ourselves as a spring, where some seasons that God's going to put us in are going to be a lot more challenging. They're going to be a lot more busy, a lot more full, require a lot more of us, and we're going to be strung out a lot. Our attention is going to be a lot higher. But what happens with spring when it's sprung out for too long? It eventually will either break or completely lose its spring, right? So his point was some seasons we need to, like you're saying, buckle down and get into it. But with that vision of us having limits, of having, a stress point that can't go back from as a spring, we need to realize, okay, we need to plan for our next season to be a little bit less than. How can we put more rest into our next season if it's necessary? Because I feel like some people listening might be like, well, it's nice to think about resting, but I don't have that option. That's the thing. It's not going to always be the option in the season, but how can we plan for it in the future, right? How can I input things in my life to make sure I'm getting that rest that I will need as a limited person? So
Yeah, it's helpful because I can just see someone who just had a baby rolling
Right,
their eyes at
right.
this, like, oh yeah, rest. That's a great idea.
Right.
Human finitude.
Yes, exactly.
But yeah, there is an application to be made for everyone. So thinking of someone maybe who feels burnt out right now listening to this, what would your encouragement to them be?
My encouragement would be really based off the question of what does this mean for Christians as well as non-Christians? Because I think the hard truth, but the truth is that in scriptures, a lot of times the promises we receive are only true if we put our trust in God, right? For those that are his children and have been called according to his purpose. And ultimately, I think the news that humans are finite, that humans are limited, really is only good news for people that believe in a God that can handle that. Because if we can't be God, yet we don't believe in God, that's definitely not good news. Yet for the people that are weary, that have decided to put their trust in him, I think it is ultimately good news because it shows us how we were called to live, how we were meant to live. In the Garden of Eden, before the fall was even there, I still believe that they're created with these certain limits, right? These certain limits of needing rest, of needing companionship. We see those things built into humanity. They were not meant to be independent robots that just function completely on their own. So realizing what are the needs you have inherently that you need to look into and actually pursue giving to the Lord, whether that be figuring out how you can section off time to rest, how you can section off time for your loved ones in order to not burn yourself out. And ultimately, and most importantly, how practically can I actually lean on God in these seasons? Lean on the one that will not tire, because we certainly will. So that is the challenge. If we don't know God, I wouldn't say this is good news. So for those people that don't, how can we investigate him more? Because then it is good news if you know him.
Yeah, and I think as we close, I really love to read this quote that I feel like summarizes so much of what you just said. On page 148 of the book that we're referencing, he says, God's highest value is not efficiency, especially considered in any simple or mechanistic sense. It is love. And so my encouragement to anyone who's maybe a new parent, who's worried that they're not doing it perfectly, maybe they're making mistakes, God doesn't take off points for efficiency. I think as long as we are following the pattern of love and trying our best to love our children and our friends and everyone in our lives, there's going to be mistakes here and there, and that's okay. And so that would be, I think, our encouragement. And unfortunately, I feel like we have so much more we could talk about. But if you're interested in this book, You're Only Human by Kapic, I'd highly recommend it. We've been talking to Will Stevens about this book, You're Only Human. We really hope that you enjoyed our conversation. If you really enjoyed it, we do ask that you, if you're watching on YouTube, that you would comment. If you are hearing this podcast over a podcast platform, that you would share that with someone else that you think would really enjoy it. This is going to help us accomplish our goal of helping people find and follow Jesus, and help this podcast purpose of putting good books into people's hands. Please join us next time as we talk with Director of Kids Ministry, Katie Drennan, about a book that has made an impact on her life and ministry. Until then, my name is Jonathan Thede, and this has been Best Books.